And we are live. Hello, everyone. This is My Two Cents, and welcome back to your weekly dose of all things COVID-19 and the authoritarian nonsense that's been going on in the world. With me, myself, My Two Cents, Filthy Heretic, and we'll see if any of our other usuals join. As always, let's start this week off by taking a look at the U.S. national debt and the Federal Reserve's balance sheet. Both have been holding rather steady over the last couple of weeks, although they certainly haven't gone down. Again, I'd like to point out there are those economists that have pointed to the fact that the national debt hasn't been growing as radically as it was in those initial few months, saying this is proof that you're all just crazy conspiracy theorists. Well, and I'll grant to them it hasn't been growing as fast, but it's still growing, and what it is not doing is shrinking, which the Federal Reserve's own website claims the Fed's balance sheet grows and contracts, but their own charts show that it doesn't contract, it just grows. U.S. national debt currently $26,644,512,000,000. And as always, when you get to the 100,000 point, it's growing so fast, not even worth me trying to read it. Meanwhile, the Federal Reserve's balance sheet closed this week on about 6.9 trillion, so still floating around that 7 billion point. However, we will see how that changes if and when the government manages to send more stimulus checks. Which, before we jump into the major points of discussion for this week, I'd like to point out the Trump administration has been bragging rather loud about how well the economic recovery is going. His White House press secretary, I know, tweeted out earlier this week about all the hundreds of thousands of jobs that have been created and how it just shows that the Trump administration is doing so great in causing economic recovery. Yet, President Trump himself is very gung-ho about sending out more stimulus checks and advocating for more small business relief. All measures that I have to wonder why they're so necessary if the economic recovery is really going as well as we claim it is. But then again, politicians have never been an honest lot. And this week we got one of the best darn examples of that I have seen in a long time. Now, as I've said, I've made a video on my channel before you can check out called Why Voting in Elections is a Farce. And basically pointing out that through history, it really doesn't matter whether Republicans or Democrats hold the White House or Congress. Two things always occur. Federal spending increases and the size and scope of government increases. So really, despite the minor differences between the parties, you end up getting the same thing either way. Nonetheless, I have to go after Joe Biden this week, specifically because I'm sure you're all aware, Joe Biden, the man who is slowly but more quickly losing his wits about him, announced his VP pick for this week. And who is he picking for his vice presidential nominee but Senator Kamala Harris? Now, many people applauded him, of course, and as we know, many in the mainstream media were going to applaud him no matter who he picked. But Kamala Harris is a woman of color, and Joe Biden vowed he would pick a woman of color. So this is, of course, the greatest thing Joe Biden ever could have done. But I would just like to point out that they seem to have forgotten that Kamala Harris was not so much a fan of Joe Biden back when she wanted to be president of the United States. She ripped on Joe Biden very frequently, and there were two major insults that everyone would remember from the presidential debates that took place between all the various candidates. Kamala Harris was quite adamant that Joe Biden is a racist and had a history proving that his policymaking was in fact racist. She also stated, with reference to many of the women who have accused Joe Biden of touching them inappropriately and otherwise behaving in an unacceptable manner for a person who holds the office of senator or vice president, and that is that she believed those women, and she was very grateful that they were courageous enough to tell their stories. So from that, I think it's safe to conclude Kamala Harris thought she was a better pick for president than Joe Biden because Joe Biden is, one, a racist, and two, at the very least, a sexual harasser, if not an abuser. Yet, it seems, when Vice President Joe Biden is now the presidential nominee and wants her to be his VP, he's just the greatest guy ever, and she is so grateful to have an opportunity to serve along his side as Vice President of the United States. All politicians are liars, but I mean, come on.
Yeah, we got a super chat right here. Just sorry to kind of break the topic here. But,
no problem. No problem. Lance Clemmings, thank you for the $5 super chat. He says, I gave my mother, who worries about everything and works in a prison, a call. She said masks don't work, yet they do. Cognitive dissonance, anyone?
Well, no, they don't. I don't know if you had that backwards, but no, masks don't work. We've had multiple studies from the CDC and the World Health Organization that confirm that masks didn't do anything. I mean, yeah, the N95 respirators do, but those are fairly pricey, and they were largely restricted from the white market simply because, or for a long time, because they wanted there to be a supply of those for, medical workers, medical professionals, which is, I mean, I don't agree with it per se, but it's at least I get where they're coming from. However, this whole mask thing, it's not going to be anything that resembles effective in stopping people from sneezing, coughing. Honestly, you're better off just when you feel like you're about to cough or you feel like you're about to sneeze, which, by the way, does not come abruptly. It's something that you at least have a moment's awareness that it's about to happen. You can cough into your elbow. You can turn away from the person you're talking to. There are all sorts of measures you can take to otherwise prevent people from getting sprayed. So, yeah, the fact of the matter is that the masks are just a placebo. They're there to make people feel good, to feel safe. And in multiple jurisdictions around the United States, including multiple state governments, they are required to be worn as a matter of imperial decree. And I do mean imperial decree because in many states it's just done by purely through executive order.
So, welcome to the party.
Yeah, I was just going out for a walk. But yeah, I came back like 5 minutes into the stream from the looks of it.
Yep, not too far. So, thanks for joining.
Yeah, no problem.
So, getting back, go ahead.
Sorry. Just so the topic I walked in on sounds like you're talking about masks and, the imperial decree given out by most states, which, by the way, based on my experience, if you walk into most businesses, they will not, they have signs on the door that say you have to wear a mask. But if you go in without one, they're not going to confront you about it. That's just been my experience.
Oh yeah, I've been going about my business completely normally. They have signs out front that say you're required to wear a mask, and I've even had people try to stop me, store employees who are waiting at the front gate for whatever reason, would say sir, you're required to wear a mask. First off, did you just assume my gender? Secondly, I just walk past them, don't even make eye contact, and everything works out completely fine.
Yeah, the closest thing that I've had to that experience was at some rest area on the east coast of the U.S. Some Karen, we walked into it, and this was one of those rest areas where they have restaurants inside of it. I don't know how many states are like that, but yeah, this Karen came up to I and the people I was with, and they were like, "Apparently, you didn't get the memo." Because we were talking about places, having these signs outside, and I mean, it was like a stereotypical Karen voice, and I sort of didn't take in what happened until 3 seconds after she walked away, and I was like, "Okay, Karen."
You don't really expect it until it happens, and I haven't had those real confrontational people yet. Mostly it's just people asking me to do something and me just completely ignoring them. I haven't had the kind of confrontation, although I'm going to be honest, I'm kind of looking forward to it for all the wrong reasons. But what we're actually talking about was Joe Biden picking Kamala Harris to be his running mate. Now,
the point I specifically wanted to make is, yes, all politicians are liars, but this is just one of the best examples ever. Seeing as Kamala said explicitly when she was a contender that Joe Biden is a racist, and she believes the women that have accused him of sexual harassment and or abuse. But now all of a sudden that's out the window. She's his VP pick, and he's the greatest guy ever.
And it's really weird that people are calling this tone deafness. It's when things like this happen in the political process, people tend to forget that many hours are spent debating this in the in Biden's campaign, at the DNC, probably in some parts of the government, because the DNC is just an extension of the U.S. government. And yeah, this was a very calculated, deliberate decision. And if you're telling me that the fact that she's a prosecutor, the fact that, you know, she did the things that she did as a prosecutor, the fact that, you know, her ancestor was a slave owner, the fact that, you know, all these other black marks against her, that never came up once. If you're going to tell me that, I think that's ridiculous. I think this is proof of what I've been saying, you know, since Joe Biden started, you know, looking like the presumed front runner, which is that this is a controlled demolition of that party.
Well, I mean, I've watched the Democrat debates. I can tell you with absolute certainty that Kamala Harris's record of prosecuting black people for victimless crimes for all sorts of stuff did come up. I don't remember the ancestor as a slave owner thing coming up, but I wouldn't be surprised if it did. And I'm going to be honest, I didn't watch the whole damn thing because I value my sanity too much.
Yeah, I am aware of the fact that they came up during the debate, but that only really, you know, furthers my case. It was mentioned on live television. Not only that, but Kamala Harris, you know, something that you know, within the party, you know, the partyarchy framework is important to people of, you know, that particular affiliation that would identify with the Democrat Party. You know, something that's a big deal for them is, you know, race and, you know, the sexual abuse, Me Too stuff. Well, you know, Kamala Harris, that is, openly said and called Joe Biden out for, you know, racial comments in the past, and also, you know, claimed that she believed his accusers. So again, that, you know, there's literally nobody he could have picked that would have been worse. But then you just look at, you know, the sort of the characters that they are, and you know, what are the main things that the media aimed towards people of that persuasion, and the narrative around the Democrat persuasion have been focused on over the last couple months? Well, let's see. All cops are bastards. You know, even though they don't really believe that, because they want to replace them with liberation, slavery, community groups, or whatever the fuck they call them. They are outspokenly against, you know, I mentioned it, they're really hard on the id poll stuff. And they, on top of that, they absolutely can't stand old white people, old rich white people, and, you know, the so-called business Democrats. And those two people embody literally all of those characteristics.
Mm-hmm. Now, not to mention, as far as the Me Too stuff, we do have on record Kamala Harris, the mayor of San Francisco, who was about 60 years old at the time when Kamala Harris was an up-and-coming lawyer, has come out and said, I had a sexual relationship with Kamala Harris while I was married in exchange for me appointing her to, you know, high-level government positions. So we know Kamala Harris is one of those sleep your way to the top types, yet she has the gall to talk about Me Too.
There's really not much else to say about that. It's clearly a political move, and I think there's even a good number of Democrats, as in like mindless normie drone Democrats, who only vote that way because their parents did, and will just go straight ticket without any consideration as to what these people actually believe. There might even be a couple of those who might recall, hey, wait a minute, wasn't Joe Biden called a racist and a rapist by Kamala Harris, and Kamala Harris accepted? Wow, that means that she's okay with rapists and racists. I think this is going to be very transparent to a lot of people, and I think that the Democrat Party is going to be severely underestimating just how significant this is going to be. I mean, do you have any idea what percentage of Democrats are going to just not vote at all because of this? I mean, the way I see it, they could lose a total of 2 votes.
Yeah, that's going to be the more interesting thing is how all the bread tube types justify shilling for Biden.
Oh, they'll be perfectly fine. They'll be perfectly fine doing that. They'll just do the same exact thing that they do when the actual reality of the actual historical reality of their ideas is presented to them. Deny, 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 deflect, deflect, deflect.
The only argument Biden has, let's face it, is Donald Trump is a horrible, no good, very bad human being, and even a horse could run this government better. He's counting on that taking him all the way through to election day.
Can I just say, obviously my attitude towards politics hasn't changed, but I have been following Joe Biden just because the character Joe Biden is playing is such a fucking train wreck that it's more entertaining than most things. Just everything on television nowadays, and even quite a few content creators on the internet.
And I've said I have issues with Donald Trump. Boy, do I have issues with Donald Trump. But if I can give the man one victory point, it's that he's probably the most entertaining U.S. president we've ever had.
I mean, if you think he's the most entertaining U.S. president we ever had, this is why I tell people that I ironically support Joe Biden's run for presidency. Not because I believe that he would do a good job or any of that other drivel, but just because he would be the most entertaining president by a huge margin. Now, of course, I have heard theories that Joe Biden is, at best, going to be a puppet for his controllers, the same way AOC is a puppet for the Justice Democrats, or alternatively, that he'll just resign after a few hours and basically make Kamala Harris president or someone else. Or I don't know, the DNC will have their convention and they'll get some black horse candidate as the nominee instead, and he's basically just a placeholder. Either way, I would want him to be president because can you imagine this insane dementia patient doing a State of the Union address? That would be hilarious.
Indeed. And I do like Lance Clemmings' comment here. A horse could run government better. A horse wouldn't do anything, and that is already an improvement.
Well, my favorite thing about the way that those two have been advertised, for voting season so far, seems to be all of the advertisements very implicitly suggest that Joe Biden is going to die and that Kamala Harris should, they should vote for Kamala Harris. Kamala Harris is the selling point. So it's I don't know about this, but that this could be the very first time in world history that an election has been sold under the guise of, well, the guy you're voting for could die. and his next and the guy that he chose as the person that he chose as his running mate, you might get them.
I mean, I have a theory, and this is absolutely ridiculous, but I think that there is at least a little bit of merit to it, that Joe Biden simply will not win because he's from the silent generation. No, people aren't really aware of this, but there hasn't been a single silent generation president in U.S. history. Plenty of senators and politicians, don't get me wrong, but no presidents.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Interesting. Now, I did see in the it's since gone up, but I did see there was a comment saying talk about the fact that Biden wants a nationwide mask mandate. Yes, I did see that one of the major selling points for the Biden-Harris campaign is that they will institute a nationwide mask-wearing mandate if elected. I mean, Donald Trump's using executive orders to do a ton of unconstitutional stuff as well, so it's not any major departure, but it is their thing.
We got a little bit of dead air. I'm sorry, could you repeat your point one more time? I was a little distracted.
Okay, no problem. Just making sure you guys didn't get cut off. Someone mentioned in the chat to bring up the fact that Biden and Harris, one of their major advertising selling points is that if elected, they will institute a mandatory nationwide mask mandate, which is, of course, unconstitutional since the president doesn't have the power to make legislation. And I pointed out that, I mean, it wouldn't be that big of a departure from Donald Trump's executive orders that we discussed last week. But yes, definitely a totalitarian measure and not a selling point in my mind, but it's a selling point in theirs.
Which is funny because so far since the ending of the Democrat primary, it's the only promise that he's been giving out. To say nothing of the fact that in that same statement, he said like, "Oh, rights are not as important as your quote unquote responsibility," which basically means that you have a responsibility to abide by the imperial decrees of whoever happens to be in the executive branch of the United States government at the time. Yeah, apparently, that's how that works now. Now, it goes without saying that it's unconstitutional. I mean, when has the government ever been moored by the restrictions put upon it by the Constitution?
Going back to the days of George Washington, not even. It didn't even last until it didn't even last through the lifetimes of the founding fathers. I mean, come on. Mm-hmm. Lysander Spooner was correct when he said the Constitution either allows for the form of government we have had, or it was powerless to prevent it.
Either way, it was not fit to exist. So the idea that somehow you're going to get some kind of restriction from it is just absolutely ridiculous. However, I'm pretty sure that what would end up happening is, well, more of the same. If there were actually any candidates that were a direct threat to the interests of the government, they would have been weeded out a long time ago. They wouldn't have been allowed to even get into the primary process. So the only reason that we have Trump versus Biden is because, well, they don't act in either of our interests.
It's very interesting, though, how the attitude that the government seems to be trying to prep people for is that of dropping all pretense of trying to follow the law. Because, what isn't the main thing that we're sold about the government? The idea that the law restricts what it can do to people. Well, I guess that's not true.
Pumpkin Row, thank you for the super chat. If one must vote and we pretend that it matters to do it, could we all agree that it's best to vote for Limberbutt McCubbins? The time would be meow. Well, I will point out, I believe Mickey Mouse still gets about 2% of the national vote every year.
How's that number been fluctuating over time? I'm curious if that's been increasing.
Yeah, I'll have to look that up.
I mean, from what I can tell, a lot of people are becoming increasingly disenfranchised, and you can see even a semblance of this in the rhetoric. This really began in 2016, but I think it's ramping up in 2020, where people aren't voting to support a candidate. They're fighting to defeat the other candidates. I remember seeing a poll, actually. I didn't really look into the poll that much, but I saw the headline on Zero Hedge about how 25% of Democrats are in full support of their candidates, while 51% of Republicans are in full support of their candidates. Now, it goes without saying that when November does come around and they're going to be asked to vote, that they're going to just rally around whoever the candidate's going to be and just vote straight ticket Republican or Democrat respectively. But it does show that most people aren't really in support of their candidate. They just don't want the other guy. It's largely oppositional. And I think at that point, people are starting to come around to the idea that politics is just not in their interest. It's entirely defensive at this point.
And well, that's exactly what it is. It's that's sort of what the mentality has always been. It's just an act of self-preservation, or at least that's how people who vote see voting. You're prepped from the very beginning of when you're starting to develop your sense of what your interests are, that legislative decree essentially is the base for everything, and that politics influences legislative decree, and to influence politics, you got to vote.
Well, so on that note, let's go ahead. Wait, do you have some more, so?
I was just going to say, so what we're seeing right now is just sort of that on full naked display.
All right, moving on to the next topic for this evening's stream. Filthy sent in this article, I believe, and it was posted at Zero Hedge, written by Tyler Durden. But a report coming out of the country of Thailand. Kindergartners in Thailand sealed in plexiglass cubicles. Quote from the article: Thai kindergartners' days are so structured now because of COVID that any semblance of free play and exploration is gone. Take a look at the pictures from one elementary school and you will think you're looking into a dystopian future. Maybe that's where we are. Children are separated by plexiglass barriers at desks and isolated in plastic cubicles to play. They stand where they're told and wear masks and face shields all day long. This is not an education. It is just indoctrination.
Yeah,
Now,
that is literally like a solitary confinement block in like a max security prison.
I mean, we already knew for a while that the Prussian model of government schooling is based off of prisons, or at the very least strongly resembles prisons. Now they're just not even trying to pretend anymore. You have all sorts of kids who are basically treated as prisoners that are guilty until proven innocent, and even if they are proven innocent, they're still locked up behind their masks, their cubicles, and basically barely allowed to interact. I'm sure that Thailand schools are actually more ruthless than U.S. schools, and if you recall, if you're talking to fellow classmates who might be like a foot away from you, and the teacher hears it, they just start to reprimand you. Well, here it's like if they're 6 feet or more away, you're going to have to kind of speak up, make yourself pretty easy to be heard. And at that point, it's like you can't communicate with anyone. To say nothing of the fact that with the 6 feet mandate, you have capacity for places like in cafeterias, which already are typically packed during lunchtime. Now you're only going to be able to have like maybe 1/3 or 1/4 or some small fraction of the student body able to have lunch at any given time. So the possibility of social interaction at all is just simply going to be completely eradicated. Now, this is a point I was talking about with my 2 cents before the stream about how what's really going on here, whether they're trying to do this intentionally or not, I don't know. Though I'm going to be honest, I'm well past the point where I'm willing to give politicians the benefit of the doubt, is that they're teaching kids to fear and loathe social interaction, to regard their fellow classmates with suspicion and as a possible vector as a means of getting them sick. And while typically kids do get sick a lot in government schools because, let's be honest, those places are damn petri dishes, here this is actually going to be reinforced through the methodology and the means that the schools are making to make sure that nobody is able to get sick at all. So they're going to, the fact that they're wearing masks, the fact that they're wearing face shields, the fact that they're in plastic cubicles are going to be constant reminders to to try to stay safe, to try to avoid other kids, all sorts of other things of totalitarian control. So they're just going to regard everyone else with suspicion, with fear. And this is, of course, going to stunt their social growth and social development, or at least as much as you can get in terms of the kind of fake social interaction in government schools where a whole bunch of people who otherwise would not interact or otherwise come together are basically forced together, and everybody is at the mercy of the lowest common denominator of the most ruthless, the most evil, the most sadistic kids in that area. But that said, this is actually something I was going to talk about before in regards to the extent to which government schools already discourage social interaction and positive social behavior. You have kids indoctrinated into the cult of statism to regard authority as the only measure and the only mechanism by which one can achieve success. As such, they become fearful, they become introverted, and although I have no evidence for this whatsoever, I hypothesize that introversion is a relatively new phenomenon and would probably only start to be observed when you would see government schools start to become prominent in the West. So with this in mind, you're going to end up with a whole bunch of people who are going to seem introverted by the standards of introverts. People who are going to be absolutely fearful of social interaction at all. They're not going to be able to network. They're not going to be able to do interviews with they're not going to be able to do interviews and not going to be able to, source clients, to be able to talk to clients. They're going to be very fearful of just intimacy in general. And as such, you're going to be just creating an entire generation of very anxious, very depressed, very fearful people. And it's absolutely monstrous. This is nothing short of child abuse.
Well, and I think that you're right. I've sort of, been suspicious of the very same, motivation here. And the reason how I came to that conclusion was because that's exactly how counter economies start. They start on a local level, people organizing by trading with one another between their neighborhoods for like garden produce or like eggs or stuff like that. So that if the entire population is being prepped to be suspicious of people around them just by default, then it's going to take quite a bit for them to, start getting the inclination to think that they ought to counter economize with other people.
Definitely. Now, before we get too far into that, I do want to thank you, Joseph Ziegler, for the super chat. And Pumpkin Roll, I see you had one as well. I'll put that one up next. Joseph Ziegler asks, I know each of you have had your own problems with protests for policy change, but what about mask civil disobedience? Is it productive to organize such a thing for social reasons? No mask sit-ins.
Well, it's not productive or unproductive. It's just sort of you being a free person, choosing not to wear a mask.
And I would agree. I don't have problems with protests per se. I don't believe I don't believe the violence that some people have called protests is protesting at all. And I don't think destroying innocent businesses that have nothing to do with the government is at all a form of protest. That's something we talked about. But I don't have a problem with protests per se.
Yeah.
My thinking is that you don't need to organize anything insofar as doing mask sit-ins or anything like that. Really, I think all you have to do is just, if you have an organization or a group of people around you who are willing to do that, honestly, it's probably more productive to just go about your business as usual and just don't wear masks. It's just that simple. Honestly, I think it's going to be a little bit more productive of your time, because I think courage is contagious, and the more people around you who might otherwise be inclined against the idea of masks, seeing other people not wearing masks and them being completely fine, they'll probably be more encouraged to do it as well.
Yeah, I mean, I've personally seen it, walking around some of the stores around here. People, like, when they're going into the store, they look at the people who are already in the store to see whether or not they're wearing masks to decide whether or not to put theirs on. So I know, as a matter of fact, that's sort of how a lot of people approach it.
Mm-hmm. And once enough people stop doing it, it becomes fundamentally unenforceable.
At that point, yeah. You already have a whole bunch. I think I mentioned this before, but you have a whole bunch of actual sheriffs and police departments who are simply refusing to enforce the mandates.
Which is the case where I live.
Which is also the case where I live, too.
What I was going to say about protesting, though, is that, of course, protesting is not unethical, and I would never make the case otherwise. But, yeah, just from sort of a thickster perspective, I would argue that protesting in most situations, if not all situations, is only questionably effective, and the only ways that it could be effective would be like you just illustrated, making it so in situations where people are encouraged to be afraid, not to be afraid, and to want to associate with other people. And I guess in minimal ways like that, it could be, it could sort of move people towards effective libertarian ends, but it's generally a waste of time and effort. You'd be better off trying to grow a garden and trading it to your neighbors for barter.
All right, SO, I will let you answer this question. Pumpkin Row asks, what are the chances of SO having a debate with Shane Killian on the ethics of dismembering unborn babies? I feel like that'd be an awesome debate.
Oh, you mean abortion? Well, I've been trying to get a debate with Shane for a while now, not on abortion, but on thick versus thin libertarianism, which, for those of you who don't know, I'm putting out a video on that. I was actually like writing a video on that subject as we speak, but very briefly, the way that sort of like mainstream Austrolibs, like the people who are in the sort of the cult of Rothbard, even after he, completely lost it in the 90s, they look at the NAP and ethical philosophy from a Kantian perspective, which, means that essentially they have this idea of what's ethically true, and that's intertwined with morality. So in order for society to be ethical, everybody has to apply ethical standards to themselves. And that's why that's why they have no objection to engaging in party politics. And that's why those kind of libertarians are, obsessed with debating everybody and, thinking that everybody has to be a libertarian to, get to more libertarian ends. They think of it as a numbers game. Thick libertarianism is the NAP conceived of from an Aristotelian perspective. So, the ethical philosophy of Aristotle, which is it's a very simple way to think of it, would be, Kantians conceive of the NAP first and then try and look at what that implies, and then sort of construct a social order around that. Aristotelians would sort of do the footwork, they understand free will, that leads to self-ownership, that leads to natural law, and they would sort of work out the logical implications of all of these steps independently, and then arrive at the NAP, and from there work out the best possible way to see the NAP applied in society. And I mentioned this earlier in the stream, but I would consider myself to be a thick libertarian. It's a funny term, but
okay. Well, I think
yeah.
that was a little bit divulging from his question of what would it take to see you debate Shane.
My point though was just I've been trying to get Shane to debate me for a while, but he keeps putting it off, and it starting to piss me off. But I wouldn't say that I'm bothered too much by it. I just wish that he would.
All right. Well, I guess if Shane, if you happen to be watching this, the ball's in your court, and of course you're free to debate or not debate anybody. So we'll move on from there. So this last article was a recent send to me from Filthy. MSN.com reports China denies plan to seize Nigerian assets over debt. This is an article posted 5 days ago. I'll read the first two paragraphs here, and then we'll summarize the rest. But the hottest debate in Africa's largest economy over the past week has been over the possibility of losing its sovereignty to China over bad debts. It has come amid a wave of claims by federal lawmakers who are pushing for a probe into China's lending practices to Nigeria in the wake of a sovereign guarantee clause in loan agreements that has been erroneously interpreted. The dominant and controversial narrative is that the clause could see Nigeria sign away its sovereignty in the event of a payment default, and the outcry has proven significant enough for China's embassy in Nigeria's capital to deny any plans to seize Nigerian assets. So basically, Nigeria, which is not the richest country in the world, but the largest economy in Africa, is at least it's been alleged that if they default on their debts to China, China will effectively annex Nigeria and make it part of the country. What I can say to that is, I think, in effect, this is kind of the form of economic warfare we see taking place in today's day and age, in that in ages past, countries would actually formally invade another country, tear down its flags, and put up their own and say, you are now part of our country. In today's day and age, countries have ceased doing that and instead simply created states of dependency, economic or otherwise, with these nations, basically told them, we'll let you you are independent, but if we ask you for something, you darn well better give it to us. And those countries are smart enough to realize they'd better comply or else bad things will happen to them. China is not unique in this regard. I'd say the U.S. has plenty of relationships with smaller countries that are exactly that fashion. So regardless of what the official narrative is, I would suspect effectively that already is the kind of relationship they have with China. But
oh yeah, in fact, like
definitely
what China's doing is basically what the United States does with the IMF, except with a little bit more efficiently. Rather than just owing debts to the IMF, which is 1 degree removed from the United States, they owe directly to China. So yeah, this is the kind of same kind of financial imperialism that you described. You just have a whole bunch of people who owe a lot of money to, say, China. And as such, as you can basically control their debt, you control their finances. And if you control their finances, you control them. So it goes without saying that China's plan is not obviously to just directly annex Nigeria, but rather to make deals and payment plans, quote unquote, that involves favorable deals to Chinese assets, Chinese developers, Chinese companies, that sort of thing. One thing people usually forget is that Africa has arguably one of the largest reserves of untapped resources in everything from minerals to ores to oil to basically any natural resource you can think of. Africa has that in absolute complete abundance. And so it goes without saying that. Yeah, sorry, continue.
Sorry. And thanks to a combination of planned economies and international cartels on commerce, such as the World Trade Organization or the IMF, every single one of those areas where those reserves can be found in abundance are monopolized by those states, and the only people allowed to harvest those resources are a small handful of multinational companies out of China and the US. I mean, it's kind of already like that everywhere in Africa.
The irony is, I've heard... there are so many socialist YouTube channels that try to point to Africa and say it's an example of capitalism's failures, yet virtually every country in Africa has a totalitarian socialist government. Or effectively just a criminal syndicate running the country.
Oh, yeah. And the fact of the matter is, like, this whole thing is not limited to Nigeria. Nigeria may be one of the most significant examples, but the fact of the matter is, like, Chinese tentacles have been encircling a lot of countries in Africa. I don't remember names of some of those off the top of my head, but I would imagine that if you were to look at a map, you would basically be looking at probably half the continent owes something to the Chinese government. And I imagine the same is going to be true for a lot of third world countries as well. As I'm sure you're aware, we've been seeing a lot of third world countries going into default, seeing their central banks collapse, the most prominent of which being Lebanon. And as a result, well, you can imagine what happens when countries who owe debt to China suddenly don't have the money to pay them back. Well, we're just going to have to take some assets and get some more favorable deals, aren't we?
Mm-hmm. And of course, the Chinese government will let their president or king or whatever they've got stay on the throne. They'll nominally allow them to maintain their independence because they don't want the social backlash that would come from actually making it part of China. But really, whatever flag you've got flying over the country is irrelevant so long as they're getting the assets that they want.
Yeah, pretty much. I think this is something that China figured out a long time ago, which, I mean, good for them, but it's also absolutely monstrous and just completely reprehensible. It's just a new form of imperialism, and I just can't help but laugh when I think I saw a tweet yesterday or the day before about how China is a great success story of a country that achieved wealth and prominence without any imperialism whatsoever.
Mm-hmm.
Laughs in Uyghur slave camps.
Yeah, and funny how the mainstream media never seem to talk about that. The Chinese are slaughtering their own people, yet on the level of the Holocaust, and yet it's not worthy of mainstream news coverage.
I mean, to his credit, I actually did see that Bucker Barlson talked about it. So, I mean, good on him. But yeah, you're right. The mainstream media does not really want to talk about it. And I can't say I blame them because it does not a very good look for them. You have this totalitarian regime that is trying to be this great model for how to respond to the coronavirus, how to stop this great and evil pandemic. And they're basically engaging in Hitlerian concentration camps, forced labor. Not a very good look. But
I know that we've spoken about this in past streams before, but they basically very much have reconstructed in American state media the dichotomy between the U.S. and Soviet Union. Like if you look at how they were talking about the Soviet Union in the 50s, 60s, 70s, the people, the Democrat media at the time would have been they were describing the Soviet Union as sort of the competing economic power. Like the model of the future is the Soviet Union. And if you were looking at, the conservative statist side of the media, you would see them talking about the Soviet Union. You'd have that one guy, in this case, it's Bucker Barlson. Back then, it would have been Buckley, pointing to the fact they use slave labor and pointing to their influence over the international markets. And, now there's, Pompeo a couple weeks back essentially, said that they're a threat to the American government. So, there's even a Cold War narrative going on.
I mean, I wouldn't be surprised if the United States government is making the war drums. However, I'm still not sure if we're going to be going to war yet, simply because I haven't seen the threat to little babies story yet, which is a very peculiar thing. Before every war in United States history, there's always some threat or some story, whether real or imagined, of the evil country, whatever that happens to be. What they always do is they drum up threats that they do against kids and babies. If you recall, for example, what's her name? I can't remember her name off the top of my head, but she was the daughter of the Kuwaiti ambassador to the United States, who was brought before the United States Senate in 1990, I believe. And she had this sob story about how Saddam Hussein would have Israeli troops go into hospitals and rip kids out of their incubators and then just kill them. That, of course, was completely false, but I mean, it was largely a pretense for the Gulf War.
Yeah, by the time it was discovered to be false, the Gulf War, was already over, I think.
Yeah, and the same, I can't remember specifically, but I remember a similar thing was done to justify the Iraq and Afghani wars, and you'll see something very similar being done with China. Mm-hmm. Now, given that the mainstream media does operate in their interest, you'll start to, I imagine the way it will go about is that you'll start to see stories about Uyghur kids and babies and how horribly they're treated and how they're just straight up murdered because they're not useful to the state. It's possible. I don't know for sure, but that seems the most likely route. Now, whether or not that's true, I don't know, but yeah, that's the narrative they'll probably go with.
I was going to say quickly, what's interesting is I think even the politicians have figured out at this point that war is economically not good for a country. It was Bastiat. Well, I don't know if it was Bastiat who first pointed it out, but he's definitely one of the more famous people to point out that destruction does not nor can it create wealth. And therefore, if a war is going to be profitable for a country, whatever resources you seek to obtain through the war must be of greater value than all the assets you're going to lose in that war. You've got to pay your soldiers die. You got to build a lot of military equipment. It gets destroyed in battle. You got to repair it. You got to build new ones. And in most cases, a large scale war between two world powers is going to cost far more than either country actually wants to obtain. And I think that's why we haven't had actual full scale peer to peer level war since World War II. Now, could that ever change? It certainly could. But I think right now, both the United States and China, for all their rhetoric, understand that neither of them are going to obtain what they want through an actual full scale war with the other.
Yeah, well, I mean, you know, Bastiat, you know, the way he put it is it doesn't, you know, create wealth. It, you know, destroys wealth. I think a better way of putting it would be that it redistributes wealth because it creates, you know, it requires a lot of people to end up creating debts and loans and to spend. It's the reason why the state deliberately starts conflicts. They have a very clear incentive to do that because the state gains quite a bit from doing that.
Mm-hmm. I would still say, though, the conflicts they've created have been, for the most part, smaller scale wars between proxy states, not large scale world power level wars like we saw in World War I and World War II.
Well, this is also a recurring thing throughout history, where you have. I mean, I'm pretty sure you're at least aware of the fourth turning theory. My 2 cents.
I am. We've talked about that on previous streams.
Yeah. Well, that's also a recurring thing throughout history where the large wars, like the Great World Wars, always occur in those 80-year periods. And in the last fourth turnings, like every fourth turning throughout history has ended with a major war. That doesn't mean necessarily it has to, but it's just been the pattern throughout history. But of course, before the fourth turning, you always have these smaller scale wars that happened before. So, for example, in the Seculum during the Civil War's fourth turning, you had the Mexican-American War. Prior to the American Revolution, you had the French and Indian War. And you can go back and find other examples of this over and over again. Yeah, World War I was an anomaly by how large it was, but it dwarfed in comparison to the continental scale conflict or the global conflict that was World War II, which involved virtually every continent as a battlefield on the planet. I think only Antarctica was spared, and I wouldn't be surprised if the Nazis tried to make a grab for that too.
Well, something like that, you know, is probably coming. And, you know, I think, coronavirus it's not even remotely comparable to the amount of destruction and death World War I or World War II caused. But I think coronavirus, considering it's pretty much uncontroversial that it was manufactured state lab, even though it's still kind of controversial to point out the fact that that lab was funded by American universities, so it was actually a joint project between the Chinese and U.S. government. But regardless, the state at this point. So,
you're roboting pretty hard right now.
Am I good now?
Yeah, you're good now.
Okay. But where I was going with that is just that, you know, coronavirus itself is an example of the state, you know, in order to try and save its political economy from ruin, trying to manufacture demand for all these loans by engaging in violent, aggressive behaviors. And it still wouldn't surprise me because, you know, despite basically setting up a planned economy, like wartime planned economy in the U.S., they still, you know, continue losing all this revenue because of people going into counter economies or people who are just simply, you know, disassociating from these state services. And it's to the point where the government is actually, like you were telling me this last night, that they're actually taking back some of those $1,200 loans they gave out to people.
Oh yeah, I mean, this is another thing I wanted to talk about. where the IRS actually, everyone remember the Payment Protection Program loans, that $500 billion that was earmarked to be given out loans to small businesses, but was actually just a bailout to the financial industry as the loans were distributed through the banking system. Yeah, that was the IRS has decided to categorize that as income and is now requesting that people who received a Payment Protection Program loan to report it as income, which then makes it taxable at about 30 to 40%. So yeah, that's going to be very difficult for a lot of people who receive those loans on the expectation that they were not taxable, which was, by the way, in the law. That was something that was put in there. And I've actually talked to someone IRL who actually read through the entire damn thing and said that no, the thing about it being taxable is not in there at all. And you can imagine like people's shock, people who wanted to keep their businesses open and they took these loans out, or rather they accepted these loans, and the government then decided like, yeah, these loans are now forgivable, so you actually don't have to pay them back. Now they're coming around saying, oh, by the way, you owe us 30 to 40% of that money that was given to you.
Funny how nothing actually comes free.
Yeah, it's very interesting how they could just change the category of what something is classified as arbitrarily. I mean, I can say with absolute certainty that there's a very large number of small businesses who would never have taken out those loans if they thought that they were going to pay them back, because now that actually puts them in a significantly more difficult position than they were to begin with.
They're probably going to have to default. But my point though was that this is, totally unprecedented. Giving out these, stimulus packages, aka money printer go burr, giving out money and then like demanding it back because the government is, so financially screwed that they need that in order to, perform basic functions. That's the situation that we're in right now. So it absolutely would not surprise me even a little bit if, the Cold War with China right now were to escalate into a series of proxy wars, if not, a war with China, like an actual war with China. In fact, I initially predicted that's what 2020 was going to start out with because of exactly this situation, the US government being in a bunch of debt and constantly lowering interest rates to try and save itself from a depression.
But it ended up being COVID instead.
Well, I don't think the COVID is going to really end up being the fourth turning crisis. It's just not significant enough. What ends up defining a crisis is really some great major existential threat to society, which transparently COVID is not. And there's always going to be some great conclusion of these great crisis events that are unambiguous and very significant in nature. Like, we're talking about something as significant as Victory over Japan Day, where the outcome is very clear and the fact that it's over is unambiguous. So I don't think it's going to be coronavirus. I think coronavirus, was just a fake manufactured crisis for the sole purpose of helping the government maintain its funding, maintain its power, by creating some excuse for them to, money printer go burr. That was the point from the very beginning, I think.
JC Armitage here says elegantly, and yet people still go around saying taxation isn't theft.
Taxation is, by every definition, theft. You can't say otherwise. I mean,
Absolutely.
You can, but you'd be incorrect.
I mean, at this point, it's, I guess it's helpful. It's a helpful thing to point to, just for a double standard that exists between the government and you. But at this point, I think, nobody would argue that's the worst thing that the government's doing on a systematic level.
In regards to things that the government does to people, taxes, it actually falls into one of the most mild forms of control and exploitation.
I mean, it's just sort of the basic form that governments are required to engage in order to survive, and it's it's a terrible thing, but compared to murdering people because they didn't submit to some random asshat wearing a badge, or forcing them into slave labor after imprisoning them for refusing to pay said taxes and print propaganda for the very people that actually threw them in the cage. And this is something that's really been going on throughout all of U.S. history, and states have an inherent systematic incentive to do well. Just the mere act of taxation seems very mild in comparison.
Well, and on that note, we have reached the top of the hour. So, quick, you guys have any closing thoughts on anything we've discussed up to this point?
Well, I mean, it has been a particularly slow week, though. I don't think we ran out of time, but I did want to get into an article about how going into the whole natural monopoly fallacy that we were talking about last week, because I was going to bring up an article about how there's a company now that's trying to develop wireless electricity.
Interesting. I mean, I guess if you wanted to talk about the natural monopoly fallacy, then you can, but that was, one of the essays that I have on the chopping block, and it's going to be far more detailed than anything we can say here.
Yeah.
All right. Well, then I'll encourage everyone to be on the lookout to the Back Alley Philosophy YouTube channel for when that essay comes out. Otherwise, thank you, everybody, for showing up. We'll be back next week with whatever's going on, and never seems to be any shortage. So, Filthy Esso, thanks for being here. And as always, that is my 2 cents. Take it for what it's worth.
Bye.